Welcome to the deep dive. Today we'll be taking a deep dive into evolution.
Oh, fantastic.
More specifically, how evolution helps us make sense of the incredible variety of life we see on Earth,
The diversity, yeah.
but also how it reveals the underlying connections between all living things, even the ones that seem totally different. For this deep dive, you've sent over some lecture notes on evolution.
Right.
And also some excerpts from a biology textbook. So are you ready to get started?
Absolutely. Let's dive in.
Okay, great. It really is a fascinating paradox.
It is.
This immense diversity of life, but then when you look closely, you find these recurring patterns. It's like nature is using the same building blocks, but creating entirely unique structures with them.
It is like nature has a limited number of ingredients, but an unlimited number of recipes.
Yeah.
You know, it's
Oh,
remarkable.
I love that.
Yeah.
I love that. And that's where evolution comes in. It's the key to understanding both the unity and the diversity of life. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's make sure we're all on the same page.
Yeah.
When we say evolution, what exactly are we talking about?
Well, at its very core, evolution is about change over time. It's the process by which species accumulate differences from their ancestors as they adapt to different environments over time. And it's important to remember that evolution is not about like striving towards perfection or some ultimate goal. It's about this continuous adaptation driven by this interplay, constant interplay between organisms and their surroundings.
It's like a never-ending dance between life and its environment.
Exactly.
Pushing and pulling, shaping and reshaping, over generations.
Precisely. And that dance has given us everything from the simplest bacteria to the complexities of the human brain.
Yeah.
And speaking of that variety of life, your source material talks about classifying all living things into three major domains: bacteria, archaea, and eukarya.
Right. It's pretty mind-blowing when you think about just how many different species there are out there. One of the sources mentioned like hundreds of thousands of plant species alone.
It's really remarkable.
Yeah.
I mean, just think about the tens of thousands of vertebrates and then millions upon millions of insect species. We haven't even begun to scratch the surface of cataloging all the diversity out there.
Exactly. And that's just what we know about. Right. So I get that we need a system, but how does evolution actually create this diversity? What's the engine driving these changes over time?
One of the key mechanisms is natural selection.
Okay.
And the beetle example from your lecture notes really brings this idea to life.
Yeah, the one where the beetles living on darker soil gradually become darker themselves because the lighter ones get picked off by predators.
Yeah,
It's a powerful image.
It is. It really highlights how variations within a population can lead to differences in survival and reproduction. So in this case, darker beetles have a better chance of blending in, surviving, and passing on their genes.
Right, right.
And over generations, the population shifts, becoming better suited to that environment.
So it's not like individual beetles are choosing to become darker, right?
Yeah.
It's more like the environment is doing the choosing by favoring the traits that make them more likely to survive.
Precisely.
It's almost, I remember when I first learned about natural selection, it just kind of blew my mind.
It's a powerful idea. Yeah.
That it's not a conscious choice.
Right.
It's just the way that the environment interacts with variation.
Right. Natural selection doesn't have a plan.
Hmm.
It doesn't have a goal. It's a blind process. It's just a consequence of the interaction between variations within a population and the ever-present pressures of the environment.
So this brings us to adaptation.
Yes.
Your textbook used the example of bat wings.
Yes. Bat wings. What's fascinating about bat wings is that they're essentially modified mammalian forelimbs. Over countless generations, the bones and skin of their ancestors' forelimbs slowly changed, shaded by natural selection to create these incredible wings perfectly suited for flight. It's a fantastic illustration of evolution's ability to build complexity from pre-existing structures.
It's like nature is a master tinkerer,
Yes.
taking an existing design and modifying it in unexpected ways to create something totally new. Now, all of these observations and countless others ultimately led to one of the most important scientific theories ever developed, Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection.
Yes, and it's worth noting that Darwin didn't develop his ideas in a vacuum. He was building on the work of many scientists who came before him. People who were starting to grapple with the idea that life on Earth was not static, that it had changed over time.
Your source material mentioned Georges Cuvier, a French naturalist who studied fossils. What was his contribution to evolutionary thought?
Well, Cuvier's work was focused on the fossil record, and he was one of the first scientists to really recognize that fossils were evidence of extinct species.
Oh, wow.
And this challenged the prevailing view at the time that the natural world was unchanging and eternal. Cuvier's work really opened the door to the idea that life on Earth had a history, a story that unfolded over these vast stretches of time.
So Cuvier helped establish that species could disappear, but what about the idea that new species could arise?
Well, that's where Jean-Baptiste Lamarck comes in, another French naturalist. Lamarck proposed a mechanism for evolutionary change that he called the inheritance of acquired characteristics.
I remember learning about that. It's the idea that organisms could pass on traits that they acquired during their lifetime to their offspring. Like if a giraffe stretched its neck to reach higher leaves, its offspring would inherit slightly longer necks.
Exactly. Lamarck's idea was groundbreaking in recognizing that the environment could influence the traits of organisms.
Hmm.
However, we now know that acquired traits generally aren't passed down through genes in the way that he envisioned.
Right, right.
But even though his specific ideas weren't entirely accurate, Lamarck contributed to this growing understanding that life wasn't fixed,
Yeah.
that it could change over time.
So even though he wasn't entirely right, he still played a really important role
Absolutely.
in kind of moving things forward.
And his work, along with Cuvier's and others, laid the groundwork for Darwin's revolutionary theory.
Your source material also mentions a geologist named James Hutton. What role did geology play in shaping evolutionary thought?
Hutton's contribution was this concept of gradualism.
Okay.
He argued that geological changes, like the formation of mountains or canyons, happen slowly and incrementally over these vast periods. This was a radical departure from the prevailing view of catastrophism, which held that Earth's features were shaped by these sudden, dramatic events.
So instead of a mountain range like forming in a single massive earthquake, Hutton suggested it was sculpted over millions of years
Right.
by the slow, steady forces of erosion.
Exactly. And this idea of gradual change over immense periods of time was incredibly influential for Darwin.
Mm.
It provided a framework for understanding how small, subtle changes, accumulating over generations, could lead to the diversification of life.
It's like the saying, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step.
Exactly.
Even tiny changes, sustained over time, can have monumental effects. Okay, so we've established that Darwin's theory was influenced by these earlier thinkers. But what were the specific observations and inferences that led him to his breakthrough?
Well, Darwin had this remarkable ability to synthesize observations from a wide range of fields,
Hmm.
from geology and paleontology to his own meticulous observations of plants and animals during his travels. Two key observations were really crucial in shaping his theory. The first was the simple fact that individuals within a species vary in their traits. No two individuals are exactly alike.
Yeah, like us humans, we come in all shapes, sizes, with an incredible range of characteristics. And his second observation was that these variations could be passed down to offspring.
Precisely. Darwin recognized that these heritable variations were the raw material upon which natural selection could work its magic.
So it's not just that there are differences, it's that those differences are passed down through generations.
Right.
Okay, that makes sense. What inferences did Darwin make from these observations?
Well, if you have individuals with variations, and those variations are inherited, then individuals whose traits are better suited to their environment are more likely to survive and reproduce. They'll be more successful at, finding food, escaping predators, and just generally thriving.
It's like the environment is a filter,
Yes,
selecting for the traits that give individuals an advantage.
exactly.
Okay.
And because those individuals with the advantageous traits are more likely to reproduce, those traits will become more common in the next generation. And over many generations, this unequal ability to survive and reproduce leads to the accumulation of favorable traits in a population.
This is starting to sound a lot like natural selection.
Exactly. Those two inferences, that individuals with advantageous traits are more likely to survive and reproduce, and that this leads to the accumulation of those traits over generations, that forms the core of Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection.
Okay, this is all starting to click into place. It's amazing how such seemingly simple observations,
Yeah.
combined with clear logical reasoning, can lead to such a profound understanding of the natural world. But But Darwin's theory didn't just come out of nowhere, right?
Right. The groundwork was laid by scientists like Cuvier, Lamarck, and Hutton. They each played a role in chipping away at the prevailing view of a static natural world and opening up the possibility of change over time.
So Darwin's genius was in pulling together all of these different threads,
Yeah,
weaving them into this coherent theory that explained both the unity and the diversity of life.
exactly. He had this unique ability to connect the dots to see the patterns that others had missed.
What's what's really cool is that Darwin's theory, even though it was developed over 150 years ago, has only been strengthened by new discoveries
Oh, absolutely.
and advances in our understanding of genetics and molecular biology.
In fact, the fusion of Darwinian evolution with Mendelian genetics, what's known as the modern synthesis, really revolutionized our understanding of how evolution operates at the level of genes and populations.
It's amazing how science builds upon itself, with new discoveries filling in the gaps and leading to a more complete and nuanced understanding of the world.
It's a testament to the collaborative and iterative nature of scientific inquiry.
Before we dive into the evidence supporting evolution, let's take a quick detour
Okay.
and explore the historical context a bit further. The source material mentioned that Darwin's ideas weren't universally accepted when he first presented them.
Of course, as with many groundbreaking ideas, there was resistance. Some scientists, embraced Darwin's theory, but others held fast to traditional views or raised legitimate questions.
You know, it's easy to forget that even brilliant scientists like Darwin were working with limited knowledge. The source material mentioned that he even acknowledged gaps in his understanding, particularly when it came to the mechanisms of inheritance. He didn't have the benefit of modern genetics, did he?
No, he didn't. Darwin knew that traits were passed down from parents to offspring, but he didn't have a clear understanding of how this happened. That came later with the rediscovery of Gregor Mendel's work on pea plants in the early 20th century.
So Mendel's work on genes and inheritance provided the missing piece of the puzzle.
Precisely. The integration of Darwinian evolution and Mendelian genetics led to what we now call the modern synthesis of evolutionary theory. And it's amazing to think that this scientific revolution happened, in the early 1900s, building on the work of a scientist who had been largely ignored during his lifetime.
It just goes to show that even seemingly insignificant research can have huge implications down the line.
Absolutely. And this fusion of ideas has had a profound impact on our understanding of biology, medicine, agriculture, and even fields like artificial intelligence.
Okay, so we've covered the historical context and laid out the basic principles of Darwin's theory, but what about the evidence?
Right.
What convinced scientists that this wasn't just a clever idea, but a description of how life actually works?
That's the exciting part. One of the most remarkable things about evolutionary theory is the sheer volume of evidence supporting it. We're talking about independent lines of evidence from different fields, all converging to paint this remarkably clear picture of how life on Earth has evolved.
This is where it gets really interesting.
It is.
What kind of evidence are we talking about?
Well, for starters, we can actually observe evolution happening right before our eyes.
Okay.
Your lecture notes mentioned an example involving soapberry bugs and their beak length.
Oh yeah, the one where these bugs adapted to a new food source
Yeah.
with smaller fruits, and within a few decades their beaks had evolved to become shorter as well. That's pretty incredible to see evolution happening in real time.
Absolutely. It's a perfect example of how natural selection can drive measurable changes in a relatively short period.
So it's not just about ancient fossils and long gone species. Evolution is happening all around us, even within our own lifetimes.
It is.
But what about those big picture examples, the ones that span vast stretches of time?
Well, there's the fascinating story of the evolution of drug-resistant bacteria. The textbook mentioned the case of MRSA.
Right, methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus.
Right.
It's a terrifying reminder of how evolution can have real serious consequences for human health.
It certainly is.
Hmm.
Staphylococcus aureus is a common bacterium that can cause a range of infections. When penicillin was first introduced, it was incredibly effective against S. aureus. But within just a few years, resistant strains began to emerge.
And this arms race has continued with new antibiotics being developed and S. aureus evolving resistance to each one, eventually leading to the emergence of MRSA,
Right.
which is resistant to many common antibiotics. It's
Right.
it's it's a stark reminder that the misuse of antibiotics
Yeah.
is contributing to this evolutionary process, creating superbugs that are increasingly difficult to treat.
It's a chilling example of how human actions can inadvertently drive evolutionary change
Yeah.
with potentially devastating consequences.
Okay, so we've got direct observations of evolution happening
Mm-hmm.
on a small scale with the soapberry bugs,
Right.
and on a much larger and more concerning scale with antibiotic-resistant bacteria.
Yeah.
What other evidence is there?
Well, there's the compelling evidence from homology,
Okay.
the study of similar structures in different organisms.
Right. We touched on this earlier with the bat wings,
Yeah.
how they're essentially modified mammalian forelimbs.
Exactly, and that's just one example. If you compare the bone structure of a human arm, a cat's leg, a whale's flipper, and a bat's wing, you'll find this striking similarity,
Mm-hmm.
despite their very different functions.
So a human arm, a cat's leg, a whale's flipper, and a bat's wing all share the same basic blueprint. That seems pretty unlikely that such similar structures would evolve independently.
That's the key. It's far more likely that they inherited this basic structure from a common ancestor
Okay.
and then modified it over time to suit their specific needs.
So this shared anatomy, what's called homology, isn't just a coincidence, it's a reflection of their shared evolutionary history,
Right.
a testament to their common ancestry.
Precisely. And these patterns of homology aren't just limited to bones. We see them at the molecular level as well,
Okay.
in the genes and proteins that make up living organisms.
So even at the microscopic level, there are clues to the shared ancestry of all life.
Absolutely. The more closely related two species are, the more similar their DNA sequences and protein structures will be. This molecular homology provides powerful evidence for the branching patterns of the tree of life.
It's incredible to think that even in the seemingly random sequence of letters in our DNA, there's a story written,
It is remarkable.
a story of shared ancestry
Yeah.
and evolutionary connections.
Every living thing carries within it a record of its evolutionary past, a legacy passed down through generations, encoded in the very fabric of its being. And then, of course, there's the fossil record.
Right, the fossil record, a treasure trove of information
Exactly.
about life's long and fascinating history.
Fossils are like snapshots from the past, providing glimpses into the forms of life that existed millions of years ago.
Yeah.
And for some lineages, like whales and elephants, the fossil record is remarkably complete,
Wow.
allowing us to trace their evolutionary journeys through time.
So we can actually see how their skeletons changed, how new features emerged, and how lineages diverged to give rise to the diversity we see today.
Precisely. The fossil record provides concrete evidence of the patterns of change and diversification that Darwin's theory describes. And then there's biogeography.
Biogeography, the study of how species are distributed geographically.
Yes. And this field provides yet another line of evidence supporting evolution. One compelling example involves freshwater fish found on continents that are now widely separated,
Okay.
like South America, Africa, and Australia.
But how did freshwater fish, which can't survive in salt water, end up on continents separated by vast oceans?
That's where continental drift comes in. These continents were once part of a single supercontinent called Gondwana. The freshwater fish evolved when the continents were connected, and as Gondwana broke apart and the continents drifted to their current positions, those fish lineages were carried along with them.
So the distribution of these freshwater fish reflects the ancient history of Earth's continents.
Precisely. Their current distribution only makes sense in the context of continental drift and their shared ancestry.
It's all so mind-blowing. It's incredible how different lines of evidence from the molecular level to the global distribution of species all point to the same conclusion,
Yeah.
that life on Earth has evolved over time through a process of descent with modification.
It's a truly remarkable convergence of evidence, a testament to the power of science to reveal the underlying unity and diversity of life.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive into evolution. We've gone from the historical context and the key principles of Darwin's theory to the incredible amount of evidence that supports it.
It's been a fascinating journey so far.
But before we move on, I wanted to touch on one more fascinating aspect of evolution, the concept of convergent evolution.
Ah, yes, convergent evolution.
Yeah.
It's a fantastic illustration of the power of natural selection to shape adaptations in response to similar environmental pressures,
Yeah.
even in organisms that are not closely related.
So even organisms that are very distantly related can evolve similar features if they face similar challenges
Yeah.
in their environments.
A classic example is the sugar glider,
Okay.
a small marsupial from Australia. and the flying squirrel, a placental mammal from North America.
They both have those amazing gliding membranes that allow them to soar through the air.
They do.
But they're not closely related at all. Huh?
Exactly. The sugar glider is more closely related to kangaroos and koalas,
Oh, wow.
while the flying squirrel is more closely related to squirrels and chipmunks. But despite their distant ancestry, they've both evolved similar gliding adaptations because they live in similar environments with similar selective pressures.
So the need to glide through the air has shaped their bodies in similar ways.
Yes.
Even though their evolutionary paths have been completely separate, it's almost as though nature has found the optimal solution for gliding.
Right.
And it's been arrived at through two completely independent evolutionary journeys.
That's the beauty of convergent evolution.
Yeah.
It shows us that while the paths evolution takes can be incredibly diverse, the end result can be remarkably similar when driven by the same environmental pressures.
It's like nature is constantly experimenting,
Yes.
trying out different solutions
Yeah.
to the challenges of survival and reproduction.
And those experiments, those adaptations shaped by natural selection, have produced the astonishing diversity of life that we see around us.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive, from the historical backdrop of evolutionary thought
Mm.
to the core principles of Darwin's theory and the remarkable convergence of evidence supporting it.
It's been a pleasure exploring these ideas with you.
And to our listener, we hope you've enjoyed this journey so far. We'll be back soon to delve deeper into the world of evolution, exploring some of the fascinating details and controversies that surround this incredible theory. Welcome back to our deep dive into evolution. Before the break, we were talking about convergent evolution, how completely different species can end up with strikingly similar adaptations if they face similar environmental pressures. It really drives home the power of natural selection, doesn't it?
It does, and it makes you wonder just how many different ways nature can solve the same problem.
Exactly. Speaking of problem solving, one of the most common questions about evolution is how complex structures like the human eye or the wings of a bird could have possibly evolved through these gradual incremental changes.
It's a question that's fascinated scientists and philosophers really for centuries. And it's important to remember that these complex structures didn't appear overnight. They evolved over millions of years through a series of small, subtle changes.
So it wasn't like, poof, there's a fully formed eye.
Not at all. Think of it like this. Even a very simple, light-sensitive patch of cells would provide some benefit to an organism.
Oh, okay, yeah.
It could help it distinguish between light and dark, maybe even detect the direction of light.
Okay, so that's our starting point. A simple, light-sensitive patch of cells. What happens next?
Well, over time, natural selection could favor variations that improve the function of this light-sensitive patch. Maybe a slight indentation in the patch would allow the organism to detect the direction of light more precisely.
Okay.
And then perhaps the edges of that indentation begin to curl inward, forming a cup-like structure that can focus light more effectively.
I see. So each small change builds upon the previous one, gradually increasing the complexity and the functionality of the structure.
And each stage of this evolution would be functional. It would be beneficial to the organism. It's like building a house brick by brick.
Yeah.
You don't need the entire structure to be complete before you start seeing the benefits of each additional brick.
This idea of gradual refinement really highlights the incredible power of natural selection to shape even the most intricate structures.
It does, and it's worth noting that we actually have evidence for this step-by-step evolution in the fossil record. We can see transitional forms of various structures,
Wow.
showing the intermediate stages between simpler and more complex forms.
That's amazing. It's like having a series of snapshots showing the evolution of a structure in action.
Exactly. It's one of the things that makes paleontology so fascinating. It allows us to piece together the history of life on Earth, seeing how different lineages have evolved over time.
Now, another point that came up in the source material is the idea of artificial selection.
Ah, yes, artificial selection. It's essentially a human-guided version of natural selection. Think about the incredible variety of dog breeds we have today.
From tiny Chihuahuas to massive Great Danes, it's mind-boggling to think they all descended from wolves.
Exactly. Through selective breeding, humans have shaped the traits of dogs over generations, selecting for specific characteristics like size, shape, color, and temperament.
It's fascinating that we can, in a way, mimic the process of natural selection to create such a wide range of forms.
It really highlights the power of selection, whether natural or artificial, to shape the characteristics of populations over time.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, from the historical context to the core principles of Darwin's theory and the different lines of evidence that support it. But evolution isn't a static concept, is it? Scientists are still actively researching and debating different aspects of evolutionary theory, right?
Absolutely. Science is a process of ongoing discovery, and evolutionary theory is no exception. While the core principles of Darwin's theory are well established, there are always new questions to ask, new mysteries to unravel.
So it's not like scientists have figured everything out about evolution.
Not even close. There are still many unanswered questions about the specific mechanisms of evolution, the rates of change, the factors that influence diversification and extinction.
Can you give us some examples of these areas of active research?
Certainly. One area of ongoing debate is the role of chance in evolution. While natural selection is the primary driver of adaptation, random events like genetic drift can also play a significant role,
Yeah.
especially in small populations.
So it's not always survival of the fittest. Sometimes it's just a matter of luck.
Exactly. Imagine a small population of beetles living on a remote island. A storm could wipe out a significant portion of the population, and by pure chance, the surviving beetles might have a different distribution of traits than the original population. This random change in gene frequencies is known as genetic drift, and it can have a big impact on the evolutionary trajectory of a population.
So even if a trait isn't particularly advantageous or disadvantageous, it could become more or less common in a population simply due to random events.
Precisely. And this interplay between determinism, in the form of natural selection, and chance events like genetic drift, is a fascinating area of research. It helps us understand how biodiversity arises and how lineages evolve over time.
Okay, so chance can play a role in evolution. What are some other areas where scientists are pushing the boundaries of evolutionary understanding?
Well, another exciting area of research is the evolution of complex structures, like the eye or the brain. Scientists are using a combination of fossil evidence, developmental biology, and genetic analysis to piece together how these intricate structures arose through a series of small, incremental steps.
It's like solving a giant multidimensional puzzle. And each new piece we find, whether it's a fossil, a genetic discovery, or insights from developmental biology, helps us refine our understanding of the evolutionary process.
Absolutely. Evolutionary biology is a dynamic and vibrant field, with new discoveries happening all the time.
It's incredible to think that even after 150 years, Darwin's theory continues to inspire new research, new discoveries, and new ways of thinking about the world around us.
It's a testament to the enduring power of scientific ideas to shape our understanding of the universe and our place within it.
Speaking of pushing boundaries, there are some who argue that evolution is just a theory. What do you say to people who use that phrase to dismiss the idea of evolution?
Ah, yes. The word theory can be tricky. In everyday language, a theory is often just a guess or a hunch.
Right.
But in science, a theory is a well-substantiated explanation for a broad set of observations supported by a massive body of evidence.
So it's not like saying, I have a theory about who stole the cookies from the jar.
Not quite. In science, a theory is the culmination of years, often decades, or even centuries, of research, observation, and experimentation. And evolutionary theory is one of the most robust and well-supported theories in all of science.
So when people say evolution is just a theory, they're misunderstanding the scientific meaning of the word theory.
Exactly. It's like saying gravity is just a theory.
Yeah.
We have a theory of gravity, but that doesn't mean we question whether objects fall to the ground.
That's a great analogy. So the evidence for evolution is just as strong as the evidence for gravity.
Absolutely. In fact, I'd argue that the evidence for evolution is even more overwhelming because it comes from so many different fields of science. We talked about paleontology, genetics, developmental biology, biogeography. They all provide these independent lines of evidence that converge to support the theory of evolution.
Okay, so we've addressed that misconception. But even among scientists, there are ongoing debates and disagreements about certain aspects of evolution, right?
Of course, science thrives on healthy debate and skepticism. Disagreements can lead to new research, new discoveries, and a more nuanced understanding of complex phenomena.
Can you give us an example of an area where there's still active debate among evolutionary biologists?
Certainly. One area of ongoing discussion is the pace of evolution. Darwin envisioned evolution as this gradual, almost imperceptible process, with small changes accumulating over long periods. But some scientists argue that evolution can sometimes happen much more rapidly, particularly in response to major environmental changes.
So instead of slow and steady wins the race, it might be more like bursts of rapid change followed by periods of relative stability.
Exactly. This idea of punctuated equilibria suggests that evolution is not always this smooth, linear process. There can be periods of stasis where little change occurs, punctuated by periods of rapid diversification and adaptation.
So the debate is about whether evolution is more like a slow, meandering river or a series of rapids and waterfalls.
That's a great analogy.
Right.
And the evidence for both gradualism and punctuated equilibria can be found in the fossil record, which makes this an ongoing area of fascinating research and debate.
This really highlights the dynamic nature of science. Even well-established theories are constantly being refined and reevaluated as new evidence emerges.
Exactly. That's what makes science so exciting. It's a never-ending quest for knowledge and understanding.
Okay, we've explored the historical context, the core principles of Darwin's theory, the mountains of evidence supporting it, and even some of the ongoing debates within evolutionary biology. What I find truly mind-blowing is the sheer scope of evolution. It's not just about explaining the diversity of life we see today. It's also about understanding the history of life on Earth, the deep connections between all living things, and even our own place in the grand scheme of things.
It's a profound and humbling realization, isn't it? To think that we are part of this vast, interconnected web of life that stretches back billions of years, all shaped by the same fundamental processes of evolution.
It really puts things into perspective, and it makes me wonder if evolution is an ongoing process, what does the future hold? What might humans look like in 1,000, 10,000, or even 100,000 years?
That's a fascinating question. Of course, it's impossible to predict the future with certainty, but we can look to the past for clues. We know that humans have evolved dramatically over the past few million years. Our brains have grown larger, our posture has changed, and we've developed language and complex social structures.
And those changes were driven by the same forces of natural selection that have shaped all life on Earth.
Exactly. So as our environment continues to change, whether due to climate change, technological advancements, or other factors, we can expect natural selection to continue to shape our species.
But it's not just about natural selection anymore, is it? We're also influencing our own evolution through things like genetic engineering and other technology.
That's a crucial point. We're entering a new era where we have the ability to directly manipulate our own genes. This raises all sorts of ethical and philosophical questions, but it also underscores the fact that evolution is not just something that happens to us. We are now active participants in the evolutionary process.
That's both exhilarating and a bit terrifying, isn't it?
It is. It means we have a responsibility to think carefully about the choices we make, because those choices will have implications not just for ourselves, but for the future of our species.
Okay, I think we've covered just about everything for this part of our deep dive. We've explored the concept of evolution in depth, from the historical context to the evidence, the debates, and even a glimpse into the future.
It's been a fascinating journey.
And to our listener, we hope you've enjoyed this exploration of one of the most profound and awe-inspiring concepts in all of science. We'll be back soon to wrap up our deep dive into evolution. Stay tuned.
Welcome back to the deep dive. As we wrap up our exploration of evolution, I have to say this has been one of the most thought-provoking deep dives yet. It's really amazing how much we've uncovered
Yeah.
about the history of life and how all living things are connected.
I completely agree. It really is a testament to the power of scientific inquiry to illuminate the mysteries of life on Earth. We've explored the historical context of Darwin's theory, the evidence that supports it, and even delved into some of the ongoing debates within evolutionary biology. But before we go, I wanted to circle back to something you mentioned earlier, this idea that we're entering a new era where humans are actively shaping our own evolution.
Right.
That's a pretty profound concept, isn't it?
It is. We've gone from being these passive subjects of evolution to active participants. With
Right.
technologies like genetic engineering, we have the ability to directly manipulate our own genes, which raises all sorts of ethical and philosophical questions.
I remember reading about the CRISPR technology in one of the articles you sent. It's like having a molecular scalpel that allows us to edit DNA with incredible
It's a
precision.
revolutionary tool with the potential to cure genetic diseases, enhance certain traits, and even create entirely new organisms. But
Yeah.
it also raises concerns about unintended consequences and the potential for misuse.
It's like we're holding the keys to our own evolutionary destiny. But we're not entirely sure which doors to open or what lies behind them?
That's a great analogy. It's both exciting and daunting. We have this incredible power to shape the future of our species. But with that power comes a tremendous responsibility.
Okay, so we've talked about the mechanisms of evolution, the evidence, and even touched on the ethical considerations of our newfound ability to influence our own evolutionary trajectory. But what about the big picture? What does evolution tell us about our place in the universe?
That's a profound question. I think one of the most important takeaways from our understanding of evolution is that we're not separate from nature. We are a part of it. We are products of the same evolutionary processes that have shaped all life on Earth.
So we're not just observers of the natural world. We're active participants in this grand evolutionary experiment.
Exactly. And that realization has profound implications for how we view ourselves, our relationship with other species, and our responsibility to protect the planet.
What I'm also struck by is the interconnectedness of life.
Yes. The fact that we share a common ancestry with everything from bacteria to blue whales, it's pretty mind-blowing. It is. And it underscores the importance of biodiversity. Every species on Earth represents a unique evolutionary lineage, a
Hmm.
branch on the tree of life that has been shaped by millions of years of natural selection.
So when we lose a species, we're not just losing a set of genes or a particular organism. We're losing an entire evolutionary history.
Exactly. And that loss diminishes the richness and resilience of the entire ecosystem.
This has been an incredible journey of discovery. We've gone from the basic building blocks of evolution to the grand sweep of life's history on Earth. And we've even peeked into the future to consider how we might shape our own evolution.
It's been a privilege to share this exploration with you.
And to our listener, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into one of the most profound and awe-inspiring concepts in all of science. We hope you've gained a deeper understanding of evolution and its implications for our world and our future. Until next time, keep exploring and keep asking questions.